She could feel the cold steel pressing against her temple, the weight of 3 loaded rifles aimed directly at her skull. The recruits thought they had cornered her. They thought this was just another training exercise, another chance to prove themselves against a washed-up female instructor who looked too small, too quiet, too broken to be a threat. They had no idea they were staring down a woman who had survived 14 months in enemy captivity. A woman who had learned to turn fear into fuel and pain into precision. In that frozen moment, with her hands raised and her pulse steady as stone, Lieutenant Sarah Chen wasn't afraid. She was calculating, and what happened in the next 60 seconds would become a legend whispered through every military base, from Fort Bragg to Kandahar. Sarah had arrived at the training facility 3 weeks earlier, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a reputation she never asked for. The brass had assigned her to train the newest batch of special operations candidates, young men who had sailed through basic training with perfect scores and swollen egos to match. They saw her limp when she walked, the faint scar tracing from her jawline down her neck, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if listening to sounds only she could hear. They mistook her silence for weakness. They whispered in the barracks that she'd gotten the job because the military needed to fill a diversity quota, that she'd probably spent her deployment behind a desk, that any real operator wouldn't waste time babysitting fresh meat. She never corrected them. She knew the truth had a way of revealing itself. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Sarah Chen had earned her place in the shadows where legends are born, and most men break. The exercise was supposed to be simple, a mock hostage scenario where the recruits would demonstrate tactical entry and target discrimination. Sarah had volunteered to play the hostage, a role that made the young soldiers smirk with barely concealed amusement. As they moved through the abandoned warehouse, weapons raised, communication crisp and confident, they grew careless. They'd been told their instructor was formidable, but the small woman zip-tied to a chair in the corner looked about as dangerous as a school teacher. When they cleared the room and approached her position, recruit Morrison made his first mistake. He let his rifle barrel drift too close, close enough that Sarah could measure the distance in heartbeats. Recruit Jackson made the second mistake, assuming her closed eyes meant surrender rather than focus. And Recruit Peters made the third and final mistake when he turned his back to secure the perimeter. That's when Sarah moved, and the world shifted on its axis in a way these boys would never forget. The zip ties snapped like thread. She'd been working them loose since the moment they'd bound her, using micro-movements these recruits weren't trained to notice, techniques she'd learned in a concrete cell half a world away, where survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead, while your captors thought you were defeated. In one fluid motion, she swept Morrison's rifle upward, using his own grip strength against him as she pivoted behind him, turning him into a human shield. Jackson spun, weapon raised, but she'd already kicked the chair into his knees, sending him sprawling. Peters wheeled around just in time to find himself staring down the barrel of his team leader's rifle, now firmly in Sarah's control. Her stance textbook perfect, her eyes absolutely calm. The 3 recruits froze, their own weapons now pointed at each other in a tangle of crossed angles and catastrophic firing lines, while this woman they'd dismissed stood at the center of the chaos, utterly in command. The whole thing had taken 4 seconds. 4 seconds to dismantle their confidence and reconstruct their understanding of what real operators looked like. But Sarah didn't pull the trigger on the training rifle loaded with blanks. Instead, she lowered the weapon slowly and looked at each young face, seeing in them the same cocky certainty she'd once carried before the world taught her harder lessons. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of every scar, every nightmare, every impossible choice she'd made in places these recruits had only read about in briefings. You think you know what it means to be cornered because you've run drills and aced your qualifications, she said, her words cutting through the stunned silence like a knife through silk. But there's a difference between knowing the moves and understanding what it costs to use them. You aimed your rifles at my head and saw a target. You should have seen a soldier who's already survived worse than anything you can imagine. Someone who's been exactly where you think you've got her. Except for real, with real bullets and real consequences. She paused, letting them feel the weight of their assumptions. The enemy won't underestimate you because of your size or your scars or your gender. They'll underestimate you because you're human, and humans make mistakes. The question is whether you'll recognize those mistakes before they cost you everything. Over the following weeks, those 3 recruits became her most dedicated students. They stopped whispering and started listening. They learned that strength isn't about size or swagger. It's about the quiet competence that comes from surviving the unsurvivable and choosing to stand back up. Sarah taught them how to read a room not just with their eyes, but with their instincts. How to turn disadvantages into opportunities. How to carry the weight of impossible decisions without letting it crush them. She never told them the full story of her captivity, the details of her escape, or the names of the soldiers who didn't make it home with her. Some stories aren't meant for telling. They're meant for living through, for carrying forward, for using as fuel to make sure the next generation is just a little bit harder to break. And on graduation day, when those 3 recruits received their Special Forces tabs, they each saluted their instructor with a respect that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with recognition. They had aimed their rifles at her skull and discovered something more valuable than any training manual could teach. They had discovered that real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply endures, adapts, and when the moment demands it, strikes with a precision that leaves no doubt about who holds the power in the room. Sarah Chen had given them that gift, and they would carry it into every dark corner, every impossible mission, every moment when the world pressed a barrel against their temple and waited to see what they were made of. Because now they knew. Now they understood why you don't cross a Special Forces veteran. Not because she'll hurt you, but because she'll teach you the difference between playing soldier and becoming one.